Until recently, it was assumed that the height of climate denialism was behind us. The future, we were told, belonged to green capitalism and sustainable development. Convinced by both financial and political incentives, even the administrators of fossil capital had made their peace with energy transition. The late 2010s was indeed a time of momentous global climate action. Pressured by a vigorous transnational citizens' movement and large-scale climate marches, Western governments vowed to meet ambitious goals. Both the European Green Deal and the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act were templates of this moment. The new zeitgeist even extended to the private sector, with the three largest international consulting firms making climate-friendly commitments of their own. However, the subsequent rise of the far right, tragically embodied by Donald Trump's return to power, has produced a violent backlash. No longer constrained by the strictures of greenwashing, the engineers of climate denial take their cue from the cynicism in the White House to revamp their long-discarded arguments. These are the people whom Naomi Oreskes calls the merchants of doubt. In her seminal eponymous book, co-authored with Eric Conway and published in 2010, the American historian showed how, as early as the 1980s, a small group of scientists, moved by common ideological convictions and economic interests, sought to downplay the risks associated with smoking, acid rain, and nuclear winter. With the financial and political support of the Reagan administration, the purpose of their indefatigable work was to sow doubt and question the motives of scientific research in order to justify political inaction. In time, the same actors applied their biases and techniques to climate, first by denying global warming altogether, then by questioning its impact and challenging its attribution to human causes. Of recent, however, the rise of authoritarianism has enabled them to pursue a new agenda. Instead of discrediting scientific data, their aim is now to eliminate the agencies and organizations that produce it. During the Reagan era, the goal was to question the work of serious scientists. Under Trump, it is to prevent them from working. Naomi Oreskes traces the long history of fighting facts with the goal of protecting the fossil fuel industry from regulation. She emphasizes the asymmetrical character of the battle between, on the one hand, powerful players who stand to lose a great deal in the event of real climate action and who use their proximity to power to maintain the status quo, and, on the other hand, the ordinary citizens of Bangladesh, the Maldives, or the Gulf of Mexico, who would stand to gain a great deal if global warming were seriously tackled, but who have no say in the matter. On climate, more than on any other issue, the far right and its publicists are relying on a devastating and highly effective weapon: the deliberate production of confusion and ignorance. Our interview took place in Boston on March 24, 2025.
In your landmark book, Merchants of Doubt, published in 2010 and co-authored with Eric M. Conway, you trace the origins of what you describe as the modern era of fighting facts. You reveal how a small group of scientists closely tied to commercial and ideological interests has worked to obscure the truth on issues ranging from tobacco smoke and nuclear winter to acid rain, the ozone hole, and global warming. You underscore both the ruptures and continuities in this long history of denialism. So not only do we see recurring methods, but also the persistence of key conservative think tanks, and also the same political institutions as well as the same protagonists that reappear, all of whom share background in Cold War science in the Manhattan Project. To begin, what you call the tobacco strategy refers to a specific set of methods. Could you walk us through how this story unfolded? And who were its key protagonists, and how did they exploit both the problem of scientific uncertainty and the ambiguities surrounding statistical causation? More broadly, what distinguishes legitimate scientific doubt, rooted in its Cartesian foundations, from its ideological opposite?
The key strategy of the merchants of doubt is to exaggerate the amount of doubt or the amount of uncertainty in scientific work. So, as you just suggested, of course, doubt is part of science, skepticism is part of what drives science, and I would say what we could call healthy skepticism, curiosity, these are the things that underpin all scientific work. But at the same time, even though you may still have some residual uncertainties about certain questions, it's also possible to know a lot about the world. And many times scientists reach a place where they would say, okay, well, yes, there might be some uncertainties, but we know the Earth's climate is changing and we know the cause is greenhouse gases. Or, sure, there's more than one cause of lung cancer, but we know that one of the major causes is cigarette smoking. What the merchants of doubt do is to blow the doubt out of proportion, or to blow the uncertainties out of proportion, to highlight the uncertainties, to put them front and center in order to suggest that the uncertainties are so great that the knowledge is really unsettled, and therefore it would be premature to take any sort of action. And that's really the key point of it. The point is not to have a debate about science. The point is to use a debate about science to block action. So whether it's controlling cigarettes, regulating the air pollution that causes acid rain, banning the chemicals that cause the ozone hole, or doing something today to transition to a green economy, in every case, the goal is the same. In every case, the goal is the same, to block action.
Frederick cites, along with hydrogen bomb creator Edward Teller and astrophysicist Robert Jastrow, became one of the fiercest critics of the nuclear winter hypothesis, which was formulated by astronomer Carl Sagan and biologist Paul Ehrlich. When did this new phase of denial emerge? How was it reinforced by Reagan's official endorsement of strategic defense? And what role played the George C. Marshall Institute, which would later become the first public denier of human-made global warming?
The book Merchants of Doubt starts with a story about nuclear winter, and the reason it does is because we were trying to understand the origins of the story, and in particular, how a particular group of scientists started working together and in later years would become important climate change deniers. And so this group of scientists, Frederick Seitz, Bill Nierenberg, Bob Jastrow, later Fred Singer, initially come together in a debate over Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. So this initiative, known as SDI, also known as Star Wars, was an idea to put laser-based weapons in space and use those weapons to take out any potential incoming intercontinental ballistic missile. So on the face of it, it was something that seemed quite attractive to a lot of people, that you could defend the United States against a nuclear attack by taking out the weapons when they're on their way in. But it was actually extremely controversial, not just politically, but also among scientists themselves, because it was viewed as destabilizing. Because during the Cold War, most people felt that the Soviets and the United States had avoided a Third World War through something known as MAD, the doctrine of mutual assured destruction. The idea here was that both sides had giant stockpiles. These stockpiles were more than enough to destroy all life on Earth many times over, and therefore neither side would be stupid enough to launch a first strike, because they would know, let's say the United States launched a first strike, the Soviets would immediately launch their missiles. 18 minutes later, the whole world is wiped out. And so it would be mad to do that, and so MAD had this double entendre of being both mutual assured destruction and crazy. And many scientists who worked in the nuclear weapons program, Hugh Gusterson wrote a very nice book about this a few years ago. You know, if you ask yourself the question, well, why would any scientist build weapons of mass destruction? Why would any decent human being want to build a hydrogen bomb? Well, part of the answer to the question during the Cold War was this doctrine of mutual assured destruction, that by building a large, reliable stockpile, it actually kept the peace. Now, you can agree or disagree with that rationalization, but I think it's fair to say that we know that many scientists accepted that argument. SDI was potentially destabilizing, because if the United States had a weapons-based, space-based weapons program, then it meant that actually this doctrine no longer applied. And so the United States might be tempted to launch a first strike against the Soviet Union on the theory that we didn't have to worry about the counterstrike because we'd just take out their missiles. And in fact, there were people in the Reagan administration who were arguing in favor of a preemptive first strike. So this wasn't just like a bunch of, lily-livered liberals. There were conservatives in the Reagan administration who were worried about this as well. And so because of this, a large movement developed among scientists to boycott SDI, to oppose the program and to refuse to accept funds to work on it. And this was led by Carl Sagan and the great physicist Hans Bethe, who had won the Nobel Prize for his work on nuclear fusion. So very prominent, very influential scientists said, no, this is a bad idea. We shouldn't do it. We shouldn't work on it. And 6,500 American scientists signed a pledge to boycott the program, not to participate, not to accept funding. This was historically unprecedented. There'd never been a case in the United States, or as far as I know, anywhere, where so many scientists had said, no, we won't work on this. It's just bad. We shouldn't do it. And the Reagan administration was extremely upset about it, and so were some of the allies of the administration. And one group of these allies were these men. And so Seyss Nirenberg and Jastrow actually created the George C. Marshall Institute initially as a place, a center from which they would defend SDI. And so it's really crucial for the story in a couple of ways. First of all, it tells us just how these people came together in the first place, which is of historic interest. But also it shows the roots of this story in the Cold War and this idea of containing communism, because the arguments they would later make about the free market, about personal liberty, about the threats of government regulation were rooted in Cold War ideology, rooted in this idea that we were locked in a Manichaean conflict between good and evil, the Soviets on one side, the United States on the other, and with that, godless communism and God-fearing capitalism, and the idea that free market capitalism was a crucial part of American freedom. And so it wasn't just that we were fighting for freedom in some kind of generic way, but we were also fighting for capitalism as something that goes part and parcel with American freedom. So one of the things we show in the book is that this debate about SDI takes place mainly during the Reagan administration in the early 1980s. When the Cold War ends, circa 1989, you might have thought that these guys would be happy because, by all accounts, the West has won the Cold War, but instead they find a new enemy to fight. And the new enemy is environmentalism, and particularly government regulation related to the environment, because they see that regulation as a kind of backdoor to communism, a slippery slope to socialism, and they fear that if the government begins to regulate the marketplace, that this will lead us to some form of Soviet-style centralized planning. And so they shift their attention then from this explicit fight against the Soviet Union to a kind of more subtle or more implicit fight in their own mind to other forms of socialism and communism, which they fear the United States will succumb to through the back door of government regulation. And that begins to happen almost immediately, almost as soon as the Cold War ends. So the very first report that they write challenging the scientific evidence of global warming is 1989. And it's also, there's a kind of historical coincidence or contingency here. I mean, it's just sort of luck. They're not related. But if we take 1989 as the year when the Cold War, more or less ends or starts to end, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, 1988 is the year that the IPCC is created. Now, those two things are not causally related, but they end up becoming historically related because the end of the Cold War leads these scientists to shift their attention to climate change.
In the 1960s and 70s, the focus shifted to pollution prevention as acid rain emerged as the first global environmental crisis, prompting science-based regulations like the Clean Air Act. With Reagan's inauguration in 1980, however, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, began exploiting uncertainty around acid rain's causes. How did figures like Fred Singer and William Nirenberg contribute to this effort? And given Singer's earlier neo-Malthusian environmentalism, how did he become a leading voice in downplaying acid rain and later climate change?
So these two issues are really important in terms of understanding these men and also understanding why we think we can say this is not a normal scientific debate. So if we look first at Bill Nierenberg, he was the head of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where I used to work, and he had been the lead author on a major scientific report on acid rain for the White House under Ronald Reagan. Now, if you take seriously the idea of scientific independence, scientific objectivity, you would think, and I think most scientists do think, that scientists, when they take on a project like this to evaluate the scientific evidence related to a policy issue, that they should do that without political interference. They should read the science, they should try to understand the science and do the best job they can in articulating as fairly as possible what the scientific community has to say about this. And Bill Nierenberg's acid rain panel did do that, and they wrote a report. They sent a copy of the draft report to the White House, and we know, because we have the documents that prove it, we have the receipts, as we like to say in history, the White House, under George Keyworth, who was the science advisor to President Reagan, sent Nierenberg a set of changes that they wanted him to make in the report. And all of those changes had the effect of downplaying the severity of the problem, making it seem as if the science was not as settled, that maybe we needed to do more work before we were ready to sign a treaty with Canada. That was the big issue at stake at the time. And we know that Nierenberg made these changes, again, because we have the documents that show it. And we also know that, and then the report was released, and he did this without the knowledge of the rest of the committee. And when the rest of the committee found out, they were extremely upset. They felt it was quite inappropriate, but it was too late. The report had already been issued. So this is a kind of scientific malfeasance, right? He's making changes behind the backs of his colleagues under the direction, the explicit direction of the White House, so for explicitly political purposes, and it has an impact on a treaty that is in the process of being negotiated with Canada. This was the hardest chapter to write, not because it was difficult, but because it was so appalling and egregious that I really wanted to document, really cross every T and dot every I. And Eric Conway was calling me up saying, Naomi, you have to finish the acid rain chapter. It was the last chapter we finished in the book, even though it's not the last chapter in the book. So the evidence there is incontrovertible. If we look at Fred Singer, he's an interesting man, and he's an interesting case because he's a nice illustration of how you can see scientists changing their minds in response to political pressure. So in the 1970s, Singer was actually quite worried about environmental problems, and he actually wrote some rather interesting papers about environmental challenges, and specifically even making the argument that if you wait to answer every possible scientific objection, by the time you figure out all the science, it's too late, the damage is done. And so you can't actually afford to demand 100% certainty on these issues. You have to be willing to act when you have a reasonable degree of knowledge. But he completely changes his position on this during the Reagan years. And we know that Singer was a quite ambitious person. He had worked in government before. He had been the first director of the U.S. National Weather Satellite Service. We know he had hoped for a high-level position in the Reagan administration. In fact, I think we found one letter where he talks about he was, his dream was to be the science advisor to the president. And he's a kind of bitter guy because he feels that he's never quite got the recognition that he deserves either for his science or for his political work. And so he's clearly frustrated. And so we see during the Reagan administration, he begins to shift his views and take on a much more right-wing position that the government should not be acting on these issues, that the market will solve it, just leave it to the marketplace. If it's a real problem, the marketplace will fix it. And of course, we know that that argument is wrong, because if the market would fix it, these things wouldn't be a problem in the first place, right? If the market responded, we wouldn't have had acid rain. If the market responded, we wouldn't have a climate crisis. But we see his views shifting in response to the political demands of his sponsors and his allies. And so finding these earlier papers he had written, that was quite revelatory to me to see, this is not an argument. This is not really about the scientific uncertainties. It's really about what political position he has decided to take in light of these, troubling realities.
In response to the Montreal Protocol, which progressively banned the chlorofluorocarbons, the CFCs, responsible for ozone destruction, Again, scientist Fred Singer founded the Science and Environmental Policy Project, the SEPP, in 1992. How was Singer's denialist strategy once again linked to the long history of American anti-communism?
One of the things that Singer begins to do quite consistently in the late 80s to early 90s is to accuse his opponents of being communists or socialists, and to say that environmental regulation is just a way to bring in communism for the back door. And so he writes a number of articles during this ozone debate in which he says, yeah, this is just an excuse to regulate the marketplace, and particularly after the end of the Cold War, communism has collapsed, but now these people are trying to bring in communism through the back door by regulating manufacturing, regulating every single step of the manufacturing process, is a phrase he uses as one point. So basically accusing scientists of bad faith, saying, oh, this isn't really about the science. It's not really about ozone. It's really about bringing in communism through the back door. And of course, this is a really preposterous argument. Again, it shows he's the one who's operating in bad faith. Because if you look at the key scientists who did the work on the ozone hole, people like Mario Molina, Sherwood Rowland, Paul Crutzen, not a one of them is a communist or a socialist. In fact, I mean, I don't even really know what any of their politics were, but these were leading prominent scientists. They shared the Nobel Prize in 1995 for their work, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, not the Peace Prize, but the Chemistry Prize, you know, hardcore, basic, fundamental science. And I mean, I knew Sherry Rowland quite well. I knew Mario Molina a little bit. Both of them were people who were motivated by care for their fellow human being and the recognition that left unaddressed, the ozone hole threatened life on Earth. I mean, that is not an exaggeration. We can talk about whether or not climate change threatens life on Earth. I don't think it really does. I think it threatens a whole lot of pain and suffering. But I mean, the ozone hole, without stratospheric ozone, eventually ultraviolet light would become so intense that you couldn't go out for a walk without being burned to a crisp, and ultimately there would be no life on Earth at all. And that was not a consequence that Sherry Rowland thought was something that most people would want. And so he felt very strongly that he had an obligation as a scientist to explain to people why this was such a serious thing. And it had nothing to do with political economy, it had nothing to do with socialism or communism. It had to do with caring about life on Earth. And Singer knew that. Singer knew Sherry Rowland. He had met these men. He had talked to them. He had been at conferences. So it's really a bad faith argument. But it's a way of trying to discredit the science by saying, oh, this is just a hidden agenda. They don't really care about the science. They're just watermelons, green on the outside but red on the inside. And of course, that argument is made about environmentalists at all, that the environmental movement is essentially a socialist movement rather than it being what I think it really was in America, which was a movement to try to protect the natural environment and continue to make sure that we would all breathe fresh air and drink clean water.
When the White House asked the National Academy of Sciences to assess anthropogenic warming in 1979, the Academy's letter revealed deep divisions. On one side, scientists like Roger Revelle, and on the other, economists such as game theorist and Nobel laureate Thomas Schelling and Yale economist William Nordhaus. While the former argued that it would be cheaper to treat symptoms rather than causes, and that migration could be a reasonable adaptation strategy for uninhabitable parts of the globe, the latter contended that new technologies would emerge as long as governments didn't interfere. So in what sense does this phase of denialism fit the pattern you call organized delay, or what Frizos calls climate procrastination, rather than outright denial? Finally, how did these economists use the logic of discounting to prevent substantial climate action?
This episode shows how denial and delay can't really be entirely separated. Sometimes people like to make a distinction, but I think it is a distinction that doesn't really hold up. Because for decades, going back to this report, as you said, that begins with work in 1979, one of the strategies that people have used is delay. It's to say, oh, we don't really have to work on it now. We can wait and see. We can afford to wait. We should wait because technology will develop that will solve the problem for us. So there's this techno-fideist component, this faith in technology to solve our problems, tied to free market economics, because the technological argument basically is saying if we just let the free market solve the problem, as opposed to having government programs to, say, facilitate the energy transition. And so we see this tension that comes up in the report that was chaired by Bill Nierenberg, where he and some of his colleagues, particularly the economists Tom Schelling and Bill Nordhaus, are saying, oh, don't worry, we can wait and see, we can adapt, we can migrate. And one of the things that was interesting about this report is it's the social scientists, the economists, who are saying we can wait and see. The natural scientists are all, with the exception of Nuremberg, saying, no, this is a really serious problem. If sea level starts rising, if the West Antarctic ice sheet starts to break up, and they're already talking about the West Antarctic ice sheet even in the 70s, which I found very fascinating, because it's a huge issue today, but they were already aware of it decades ago. Once the ice sheet begins to break apart, there's no going back. You can't then say, oh, okay, we're going to go back and fix it. No, you have to take steps now. And so they're drawing on physical science. They're drawing on, really basic science like thermodynamics to say you can't wait until it happens. Once it happens, it's too late to fix. But Nuremberg, and I would argue for political reasons, sides with the economists and says, oh, don't worry. And anyway, if people have to migrate, no big deal. People have always migrated. And I remember when I read that, being particularly appalled by that, because I feel that it's actually quite appalling for a physicist to reassure us, don't worry if people have to migrate, because of course any historian or sociologist could tell you, well, sure, people migrate, but there's tremendous pain and suffering associated with it. And if you think about mass migrations, you think about, in recent years, the migrations out of Syria, or going back to the end of World War II, the millions and millions of people who were displaced at the end of World War II, or people who have been displaced by disease and pandemics in the past. I mean, these are dreadful events. These are catastrophes in human history in which millions of people die and millions more suffer or lose their livelihoods or lose their identity, lose their language and culture. And to just say, in this totally cavalier way, oh, don't worry, people will migrate. And there's one line, I think he said, oh, people have migrated and they've taken their horses with them. It's sort of astonishingly cavalier and astonishingly disregarding of what we know about the pain and suffering associated with migration. But here's an example where you begin to see what could be a legitimate question about, well, how much time do we really have, turn into a political argument for delay. And so in subsequent years, Nordhaus has since come around. Now he's quite articulate on why we have to act on climate change, but it took him a really long time to get there. And so you really see the ways in which people discounted the problem and used this argument that it was okay that we could delay in a way as an argument for discounting the scientific evidence.
Could you just say one word about discounting quickly?
Oh, right. So discounting can be used in two senses, like a sort of general sense and a technical sense, but they're related. So in economics, discounting as a technical term refers to making a calculation in which you try to figure out, what is the cost of something in the future. So let's say something's going to cost me $1 million today, or the same problem would cost $1 million to fix in the future. It would be better to do it in the future because $1 million in the future is worth less to me than $1 million today. And you decide how much less, maybe it's 2%, maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 10%, and that's your discount rate. So many economists have used this as an argument for why we can delay, on the theory that, well, it's better to just wait and do it later because it will cost us less because the value of the dollar will be discounted in the future. There's also, though, a kind of common sense use of the word discounting, which is to say, oh, it just doesn't really matter. I'm discounting your argument because I don't like it or I'm not persuaded by it. And so these guys are doing both. They're actually literally discounting the cost of climate change, but they're also metaphorically or generically discounting it by saying, oh, don't worry, we'll just adapt. And of course, both of these arguments are wrong because, again, they rely upon the assumption that things are not going to get worse, and especially the assumption that they will still be fixable. But what the physical scientists are saying is, no, these things may not be fixable. If the ice caps start melting, if the ice sheets start melting, this is irreversible. It cannot be fixed, and therefore, there should really be no discounting at all. In fact, if anything, the opposite. If a problem becomes unsolvable, then the cost becomes potentially infinite, and that's a strong argument for why we should act on it now.
In the 1988 presidential campaign, while George H.W. Bush promised to address global warming with the power of what he called the White House effect, the George C. Marshall Institute, founded by Jastrow to support Reagan's Cold War anti-communism, began shifting its focus from the declining Soviet threat to environmental alarmism. How did Jastrow, Seitz, and Nuremberg attempt to blame anthropogenic warming on the sun, and what does this reveal about the very concept of denial? Also, how did the IPCC relate to that dynamics, and why do we witness at the same time the foundation of the Global Climate Coalition?
In 1988, when George H.W. Bush, who has been vice president under Ronald Reagan, runs for office, he takes climate change seriously, and he makes a big speech where he says, those people who say we're powerless to do anything about the greenhouse effect have never heard of the White House effect. And so he's saying if he's elected, he'll use the power of his office to do something. And of course, he does go to Rio de Janeiro, to the Earth Summit in 1992, and he signs the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and he makes this commitment to do something about global warming. But at the same time, there's a lot of pushback. And this is where we really see the shift, the political shift in the Republican Party. So before Ronald Reagan, before 1980, many Republicans were environmentalists. Republicans had played a key role in the early environmental movement in the United States, going back to the 1900s and 10s and 20s. Republicans, progressive Republicans like Teddy Roosevelt, had played a key role in the creation of the National Forest Service, the expansion of the national parks, the setting aside of spectacular places. The Grand Teton National Park was a project of John D. Rockefeller. So many Republicans were active in the environmental movement in the first half of the century. Many Republicans had really cared about what sometimes historians called aesthetic environmentalism, protecting beautiful places for recreation, hunting, fishing, hiking, skiing. But it really changes in the Reagan administration. And it changes because of this relationship between environmental science and regulation. So starting in the late 60s and into the 70s, the US federal government passes a set of laws, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, National Environmental Protection Act, which create a framework for environmental protection in the United States, not just to set aside a few places of conspicuous natural beauty, like the Grand Teton or the Grand Canyon or the redwood trees, all these big things, big trees, big canyons, big mountains, but more broadly to protect the environment for everyone. And so in some ways we can think of the second wave of environmentalism as being more democratic, with a little d, that is to say it's more about protecting the environment for all Americans, protecting the air that we all breathe. But it was still bipartisan. In the 1960s, you still had very widespread Republican support, and like the Wilderness Act is passed nearly unanimously in Congress. Richard Nixon signs the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. He creates the EPA. So you have very broad bipartisan support. But it begins to shift. As these statutes are passed, you immediately begin to see pushback from industry. And you begin to see the chemical industry in particular, but also air polluting industries like electrical utilities, pushing back against this regulatory structure. And they begin to say America's over-regulated, that regulation is bad for the economy. What they really mean is it's bad for them personally, right? And this gets picked up by Reagan. And when Reagan runs for office, he specifically runs on an anti-regulatory platform and an anti-federal government platform, saying government's not the solution, government's the problem. And we're going to roll back these regulations and release the magic of the marketplace. This is one of Reagan's favorite lines. So this argument begins to be made, regulation is bad, the free market is good. To the extent that the federal government imposes regulations, the federal government is bad. You shouldn't like the federal government. You should be suspicious of the federal government. So it's really a crucial moment historically, especially in terms of what's understanding today, because it's the beginning of where we see the Republican Party turning against the federal government and attempting to turn the American people against the federal government. So this is all happening around this period, this crucial period in the late 80s. So when Bush gets elected and he wins office, but there's already a lot of pushback in Republican ranks. And we know in part from the work of a very wonderful graduate student in Switzerland, Audrey Lochscher. Not sure if I'm pronouncing her last name right, but we can fix it. That there was a big fight inside the Bush administration. There were people in the Bush administration who did not think that he should go to Rio, that he should not sign the Framework Convention. And we know some of those people were actually directly linked to the ExxonMobil Corporation, including the science advisor E.E. David, who actually worked for ExxonMobil. So there's this whole argument taking place, and it's right at this moment that Nirenberg and his colleagues write their first climate denial report, in which they blame it on the sun. And so this becomes a key part of the strategy, to challenge the science by saying we don't really know what's causing this, and we don't know if it's greenhouse gases. It could just be natural variability. It could just be changes in the amount of sunshine that's reaching the planet. Now, they know that's false because Jim Hansen has already done the work that refutes that claim, but they misrepresent Hansen's work. They bring it to the White House and they say, we don't have to worry about this. We can, it just might be natural variability. And so the people in the Bush administration who are anti-regulation, don't want to see the administration do anything about climate change, they seize on this argument. And this then becomes one of the central arguments that's carried into the 1990s. Oh, it's just the sun. It's the wobble of the earth. And I have a little film clip I use frequently of Lee Raymond, who's the CEO of ExxonMobil in the 1990s, in which he's asked about global warming, and he says, oh, well, there's a lot of things that cause climate change. There's the wobble of the earth. There's sunspots. And this really encapsulates the strategy. It's not a lie, because there are sunspots. It's not a lie, because the earth does wobble. But it's grossly misleading, because in the context of climate change, those are not the things that are causing global warming. And the scientific community has said so explicitly, but he's denying what the scientific community is saying, trying to distract the audience by saying, oh, but there's all these other things. So it's deeply misleading, and this is the strategy that then we see the fossil fuel industry carry forward to, and even to the present day. I mean, you might think that the arguments about sunspots have gone away, but I could point you to corners of the internet where they are alive and well and being used to deny global warming. Second part of your question about Ben Santer. So as the 1990s developed, the attacks on science become fiercer and more disgraceful. And one of the most disgraceful was an attack on scientist Ben Santer. So Ben was the lead author of the key chapter of the 1992 Second Assessment Report, which was the first time ever in history that the scientific community made a statement about attribution. And by that I mean to say, yes, we can attribute the observed warming to the increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the statement is a pretty careful one. Ben Santer has written about this. They argued at great length about specific words, but the conclusion was that the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human impact on the global climate. And that was a pretty measured statement. It wasn't crazy, it wasn't alarmist, and it was agreed to by all of the scientists and the government representatives involved in that report. But the Wall Street Journal ran an attack on Ben, written by Fred Seitz, in which they claimed that he had inappropriately changed the report after it had gone through peer review. And it was really fascinating to me when I was writing about this, because I remember reading this and thinking, oh, that's actually what they did. That's what Bill Nirenberg did with the acid rain report. So he's committing scientific malfeasance and then claiming that the actual scientists are doing that. So you see a lot of projection in these stories, and now whenever I see one of these climate deniers accusing the scientific community of doing something, I think, oh, did he do that? So they accuse Ben of inappropriately changing the report. There's no evidence that this is true. And one of the really interesting things about this particular report is that one of the co-authors on this chapter was actually an ExxonMobil scientist, a man named Haroon Keshki. So if anyone would have been in a position to out Ben if he had done something wrong, it would have been Keshki, but he never did. And he's never, as far as I know, ever claimed that Ben did anything wrong. But this was splashed all over the pages of the Wall Street Journal and then repeated. And by the late 90s, we have the rise of the internet. So then you begin to see this claim repeated on the internet saying that, the Wall Street Journal had shown that Ben Santer had inappropriately changed this report. It was completely false, but it did a lot of damage. It did a lot of damage to Ben Santer personally, who really suffered a lot during this period. And it did a lot of damage to the credibility of the IPCC, because now a lot of people thought that the IPCC was fudging its reports.
I would now like to turn to the next question about the qualitative leap of climate denial. So to what extent is climate denial analogous to the denial of cancer risks or to the skepticism around acid rain and ozone depletion? Is there, according to you, a qualitative difference between phasing out CFCs or tobacco products and overhauling an entire fossil fuel-based infrastructure that underpins capitalist modern systems of production and consumption? And linked to this very first question, how do you see the fight against climate misinformation relating to a socially just energy transition? Can we distinguish outright denial from legitimate political distrust of liberal market-based climate policies that risk deepening inequality or threatening workers' economic security?
Okay, sure, a couple of things there. So in terms of the strategies and tactics, the denial of climate change is exactly identical to the denial of the harms of tobacco or acid rain. So, I mean, this is what we document in our book. You see the exact same strategies, the same words, the same language, the same people, the same organizations. And so that was part of the point we were trying to make in our book, that this, in a way, tells us this is not a scientific debate, it's a political debate. And it's a political debate about governments, about regulation, about markets, and really ultimately about the limits and failures of capitalism. What's different about climate change is the scale of the problem. Part of the reason climate change has been so hard to deal with is because the fossil fuel industry is incredibly powerful, more powerful than the electrical utilities that were, creating acid rain, and even more powerful than the tobacco industry, although that was and remains a very powerful industry, but also because the scale of the problem is so great. As much as many, many people smoked, and as much as the American economy did rely on tobacco to a very great degree, the whole world economy didn't rely on tobacco. The whole world economy didn't rely on CFCs. But now you have a product that the whole world economy does rely on. And so the ask is much greater and the stakes are much higher. And you have many more people who stand to lose if we have this energy transition. On the other hand, you also have many people who stand to gain, but the people who stand to gain are not now in positions of power. And so it's an extremely asymmetric problem where the people who would lose are very, very powerful. They include, some of the richest corporations ever to exist. The people who stand to gain are ordinary citizens of Bangladesh, the Maldives, the Gulf Coast of the United States, the Netherlands. And these are people who often don't have a strong political voice. So even though there will be many people who will benefit from a green energy transition, they're not in the positions of power to make it happen. And that's probably the biggest asymmetry in this situation. In terms of distinguishing outright denial from legitimate political distrust, I think that question is wrongly posed, because the people who deny climate change are not the people who also have some legitimate distrust of liberal market-based systems, right? The people denying climate change are mostly people who are trying to preserve the status quo. They're trying to preserve this fossil fuel-based economy that we have that is causing tremendous damage, including a lot of health effects from burning fossil fuels. When we begin to think about the transition, there are some legitimate questions about how we do that in a fair and just manner, but that's not climate change denial. Climate change is real, but now we have to figure out how to do this fairly. So I see that as a quite different kind of set of arguments. And frankly, we haven't really even got to those arguments because we're not in that transition. I mean, some people have tried to raise those questions, but we're still in the point of fighting. Well, here in the United States, we're still at the point of fighting a president who still, in 2025, 67 years after Dave Keeling first started measuring carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, is still claiming that climate change is a hoax.
So I would like to follow up on your last remark with a question about Trump's second term. Trump follows a long American tradition of denying scientifically evidenced environmental risks, a pattern that dates, as we have seen, back to the Reagan administration. Did his stance on climate change shift in any significant way between his first and his second term? Who are his key scientific advisors on these issues? And finally, is Trump still actively denying climate risks, or has he moved toward openly endorsing them? What does this evolution suggest about the very concept and heuristics of denialism?
It's hard to say whether Trump's views on climate have changed, in part because he often says different things on different days, although his views on climate change have been pretty consistent. I mean, he's pretty consistently been a denier, and he's been claiming that it was a hoax, for, I think, a decade or more. So I don't think we've seen any significant change in his views, but he's certainly become much more aggressive. And what we've seen in the few months that he's been in office is an aggressive determination to shrink or even destroy the scientific agencies that are crucial for this issue. So one of the agencies that has been a particular target of the administration from day one is NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So why, you might ask yourself, why NOAA? Well, NOAA is one of the key organizations that collects the data, particularly the satellite data, that prove that climate change is real, that prove that this is not a hoax, that prove that the oceans are warming and getting more acidic. And so if you take away the agency that does that work, then you don't even have to deny the science anymore, you just destroy it. And so there is something particularly aggressive and tragic, I would say, about, it's really moving into Orwellian territory. You're not just fighting with the scientists now, you're actually trying to eliminate them and treating science and scientists as an enemy to be eliminated. And we're seeing that in the current administration. Also, the attempt to essentially dismantle the regulatory function of the EPA. That's not a surprise to anyone who's been tracking this, but the aggression with which he's doing it is greater in the second term than it was in his first. Who are his key scientific advisors? Very hard to tell. As far as I can tell, he doesn't actually have scientific advisors because he doesn't believe in science. He has political advisors, he has economic advisors, he has people who are doing the dirty work of dismantling federal scientific agencies, obviously Elon Musk, but I don't think he's actually getting scientific advice because I don't think he wants scientific advice. I don't think he believes in scientific advice, but we'll see. That could change if we have another pandemic. And in terms of actively denying climate risks, yes. His policy is drill, baby, drill. He wants to increase fossil fuel production. He said that explicitly. So no one who takes climate risk seriously could possibly think that expanding fossil fuel production is the right thing to do at this moment in history. So I think that, this is denial on steroids. This is a sort of supercharged denial that we not only deny that it's real and important, but we actually aggressively pursue the very activities that are leading to, I try not to use the word catastrophe too often because that's a very strong word, but these are the exact policies that I think many scientists believe will lead to some of the worst case scenarios that would really truly cause massive social, economic, and political disruption.
When you published your key article about scientific consensus of human-made global warming in 2004, climate discussions were primarily focused on mitigation. However, with the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree target effectively missed in 2024, the problem of adaptation to an ongoing catastrophe becomes urgent. How then is climate denial being reinvented in this very era of adaptation?
One thing I think we've seen throughout this story is how different arguments come and go at different times. So we can go back to the early 1980s and see people arguing, we don't have to worry, we'll just adapt. So the version of that today is, well, the climate is changing, we've missed the 1.5 limit. I don't like to call it a target because that implies it's something that you good to aim for. It's really a kind of threshold or limit that we should have stayed below and we've now failed to. So now the argument is we have no choice but to adapt. And of course, on some level that is true, and many good and principled people are now working on adaptation because it is a necessity. But it's also still being used as a kind of denial argument to say, we have no choice but to adapt, so therefore we can forget about carbon taxes, or therefore we can forget about a just transition to a green economy. And sometimes that argument is made in a way that implies that adaptation will be relatively painless. We'll just adapt. But what does it really mean in practice? In practice, it means people losing their homes. It means multi-million-dollar homes in Pacific Palisades burning to the ground. It means floods in Asheville, North Carolina, destroying whole communities. It means across the globe, in China, in India, in Europe, huge amounts of damage, and the taxpayer, ordinary citizens, left to pick up the bill. And then it also means people becoming frustrated by their government, that government didn't protect us from these things, and turning to other alternatives, many of which are undemocratic. So, in 2014, Eric Conway and I published The Collapse of Western Civilization, which was meant to be a sort of cautionary tale about what the worst extreme case could look like, not that we actually thought that would happen. And what's really scary about the last 10 years is how much of what we wrote is actually already happening, and especially the undermining of faith in democratic institutions. Because a key part of our argument in that book was, if democratic governments fail to address this adequately, you will see people turning to authoritarian solutions, particularly because authoritarian countries will actually be more able to do some of the things that need to be done. Like if you have to have forced relocation of people, and it's not going to be pretty, it's not going to be nice, it's going to be dreadful, but that's not a crazy thought. And I think we are actually seeing some of that already now. People here in the United States turning to Trump because they think he's, authoritarian in a good way, authoritative, I guess I should say. Fine line between authoritarian and authoritative, right? We want our leaders to be authoritative. We may or may not want them to be authoritarian. And in Germany, alternative for Deutschland, French. In France, the shocking success of the Le Pen dynasty, right? People saying and doing things that we wouldn't have thought even 10 years ago that you could say in civilized society, or Elon Musk claiming that Hitler didn't kill people. I mean, when did that even become possible? So we are seeing some really troubling political shifts that are obviously not caused only or even mainly by climate change. I don't mean to be making that claim, but I do think that the way in which liberal democracies are seemingly impotent to deal with big issues like climate change, I do think is part of the story of the appeal of authoritarianism for at least some people.
And in the Scientific American, you wrote a piece about carbon removal technologies. So
right.
Maybe you could explain us to which degree fossil fuel industries also rely and promote nowadays carbon removal technologies such as BECCS or direct air capture.
Some of the adaptation argument is tied to techno-fideism, the idea that we don't have to worry because technology will solve our problem. And we see lots of people in Silicon Valley, for example, pushing this argument. Just let the market do its thing. I mean, it's tied to the anti-regulation argument. Roll back regulations, empower entrepreneurs, we'll get the technology we need. The problem with that argument is that we've had 50 years for the market to give us what we need, and it hasn't happened, and particularly not at the scale we need. So I think the evidence is pretty clear that the market, or I should say markets, because the market is just kind of an idealization, markets haven't responded to the degree that we need them to, and that's where you need government incentives, government regulations, investment in green technology, these kinds of things. But one of the technologies that is sometimes promoted is carbon capture and storage, or the idea that we can capture carbon either at the wellhead, the tailpipe, or directly from the atmosphere, put in the ground and clean it up, and that'll make everything great. There are lots of problems with that argument, and one of them is that it's primarily the fossil fuel industry pushing it. And they're pushing it because they want us to believe that it's okay to keep using fossil fuels because, don't worry, we'll just capture the carbon and store it. The problem is, A, to the extent that it exists as a technology, it's crazy expensive, so who's going to pay for that? B, it won't work if we keep putting more pollution into the atmosphere. I mean, people like to use the analogy of a bathtub. Imagine your bathtub's overflowing, so you say, oh, don't worry, I'll drill a hole in the bathtub and we'll take some of the water out, and so it'll all be fine. Well, a smarter thing would simply be to turn off the tap. So there's no way carbon capture can really work for us unless we do something about the source of the increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But also, third, and again, this is, I think, in a way to tell, there are a number of carbon capture and storage projects around the globe and in the United States. Here in the United States, all but one or two of them are actually enhanced oil recovery projects. So what does that mean? When you drill an oil field, because oil is very sticky, a lot of the oil stays in the ground. So you can drill a field and the pressure will cause the oil to come up to the surface where you can then, capture and sell it. But a lot of oil stays behind. In many oil fields, it could be as much as half of the oil or even more stays in the rocks. And this has been known for a long time. This is not any kind of new revelation. So companies developed strategies that they used to call secondary and tertiary recovery. Now they call it enhanced oil recovery, because I guess enhanced is a nice word. And what that really means is flushing the field with water, with detergent, or with carbon dioxide to try to flush out that remaining oil so you get more oil that you can then sell and burn. So how do they do this? Well, one of the materials that's used for enhanced oil recovery is carbon dioxide. Yeah. And so there are projects all around the globe where CO2 is pumped into oil fields to get more oil out. The fossil fuel industry is pretending that these are climate solutions. And there's lots of places where they basically represent enhanced oil recovery projects as if they were carbon storage projects. And they're not. A, because there's actually, in many cases, no guarantee the CO2 is actually staying in the subsurface, and B, because even if it did stay in the subsurface, you're using it to get out more fossil fuels, which then you burn and produces more greenhouse gases. So it's not a climate solution, but it's being represented as a climate solution, and frankly, a lot of people have fallen for it, because in the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed under the Biden administration, which was the first substantive climate policy ever in the history of the United States, a big part of that project were tax credits for CCS projects. So we're basically subsidizing the oil industry in a way that certainly doesn't solve the problem and could actually, in the worst case scenario, make the problem worse.
I would like to follow up with a question about the specific forms of American and European denialism. Do you think that these forms can be adequately distinguished? And do you think that there are patterns of a global convergence in denialism?
I got interested in this whole question initially because of a big difference between what was happening in Europe versus what was happening in the United States. So if you go back to the early 2000s, I was spending quite a bit of time in Europe. I had a collaborative project with some colleagues in London, in the London School of Economics, and the conversation about climate change was very different than in the United States. So here in the United States, the conversation was often about climate change as a big debate. We didn't really know. Scientists weren't sure. Whereas in Europe, everyone thought, yeah, we know this is happening. And people were much more having a conversation about what the solution should be. And even the private sector conversation was different. So I remember landing at Heathrow Airport in London and seeing big signs that said BP, Beyond Petroleum. So this was the largest petroleum corporation in Britain, one of the largest in the world, saying that they were going to move beyond petroleum and adopt renewable energy. So it was very radically different. And so I became interested in that difference. Why was this conversation seemingly so much more advanced in Europe? And part of the answer to that question was about climate change denial and the role of the fossil fuel industry, and also these right-wing think tanks like the Marshall Institute, but also the Cato Institute, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the Heartland Institute, who were promoting doubt and disinformation about climate science and opposing climate action. And so when Eric Conway and I wrote Merchants of Doubt, we were really focused on this American story because we thought it was a story that needed to be told. Since then, things have changed, and we have seen the export of American climate denial to other countries. And I mean that quite literally. We have seen arguments that were not used in Europe 20 years ago being used there now. And in some cases, we can document the links from American denialist groups to groups in the United Kingdom and continental Europe. And there's a group called the Atlas Network, which is a kind of umbrella group that was created to facilitate the exchange of information, and I think also probably funding, between right-wing think tanks, libertarian, anti-government think tanks in the United States and comparable groups overseas. So what we've seen now is that many arguments that would not have been made in Europe 20 years ago are now being made there. And so in that sense, I would say we have to sadly conclude that the conversation in Europe has actually gone backwards.
I would like to follow up with the next question about the history of agnotology. And since you mentioned the difference between an outward lie and the fact to exploit scientific uncertainty, I would like to ask you to explain to us the very domain of agnotology.
Agnotology is the study of ignorance. Now, you might not think that people need to study ignorance, but historically, historians of science, philosophers of science, have really been interested in the production of scientific knowledge. And traditionally, again, both historians and philosophers have seen the production of knowledge as a process which maybe it's not linear, but it still has a kind of directionality that knowledge is assumed to increase over time. But in fact, there are forces that cause knowledge to decrease. There are forces that cause ignorance to increase. And so I became interested in this a few years ago because of my work on climate change denial and attacks on climate science. And I started working with a group of other colleagues, including Robert Proctor and Londa Schiebinger at Stanford, who were developing this field that they were calling agnotology. That is to say, the study of ignorance, and particularly the social construction of ignorance, the way in which certain social, political, cultural, or economic patterns could in fact foster ignorance. And that includes both deliberate and inadvertent. So there are people who we know have deliberately tried to create ignorance. The tobacco industry obviously is high on that list. But there are also ways ignorance can be produced accidentally or inadvertently. And so in agnotology, we're interested in both. Probably there's been maybe a little bit more emphasis on the deliberate, what I like to call malevolent actors. But I think the study of the non-malevolent actors is important as well, because it's relevant to the whole question of how scientific knowledge develops. So in my recent book, Science on a Mission, it's a history of Cold War oceanography, I look at this question in a context that's not malevolent. The U.S. Navy was trying to foster science. It was trying to foster oceanography and marine geophysics because it understood that having a good scientific understanding of the ocean would help it do its job better. So its intentions were honorable. But by focusing on certain kinds of questions that were related to the Cold War, and particularly questions related to submarine warfare, other areas of oceanography atrophied or even died out completely. And so knowledge was produced in some areas, but ignorance was also produced in others. And so in that book, Science on a Mission, I look at the trade-offs. I look at this question of how even with good intentions, we can still sometimes foster ignorance simply based on the choices we make about what we think is important to study, and also especially who's funding it.
Great.
Good. All right.
This is awesome.
All right.
This is exciting.